1831. On a tobacco plantation along the Virginia-North Carolina border, an overseer named Thomas Griggs killed an enslaved man in front of his 11-year-old son to make obedience visible. The boy was ordered to watch, ordered to remember, then dismissed as harmless and put to work inside the big house, where accounts were kept and patrol routes were spoken aloud. Griggs called it mercy. By winter of that same year, the plantation gates were ringed by 400 armed black freemen, men who did not belong to anyone, men who answered to a child they had never met before the killing. Griggs was taken alive, forced to stand where he once stood above others, and made to face the lesson he thought only went one way. How did a boy escape? How did an army assemble so fast? And why did the overseer's confidence become the weapon that ended him? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The tobacco fields shimmered gold in the dawn light, dew still clinging to the broad leaves. Ezekiel Carter stood beside his father Isaiah in the plantation yard, watching the other enslaved workers gather for the day's assignments. At 11 years old, Ezekiel was tall for his age, with observant eyes that missed little. His father's carpenter's tools hung heavy in their leather pouch, worn smooth from years of careful use. Overseer Thomas Griggs paced before the assembled workers, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The leather strap coiled at his belt caught the morning sun. Ezekiel noticed how Griggs's hand never strayed far from it, even when giving routine orders. "Carter," Griggs barked, jerking his chin toward Isaiah. "Finish that new storage shed by sundown. And mind you do it proper this time." Isaiah nodded once, his face carefully blank. "Yes, sir." Ezekiel followed his father to the half-built structure, carrying the lighter tools, while Isaiah shouldered the heavier ones. They worked in comfortable silence, measuring and cutting boards with practiced efficiency. Isaiah had taught his son every detail of carpentry since he could walk, and their movements flowed together like a well-rehearsed dance. "Remember," Isaiah murmured as they fitted a joint. "Measure twice. Cut once," Ezekiel finished, smiling slightly. It was their quiet ritual, these shared wisdom fragments passed between tasks. The morning wore on, sun climbing higher as they worked. Ezekiel noticed Griggs watching them more than usual, circling closer with each pass through the yard. The overseer's face held something ugly, something waiting to break free. Just before noon, Griggs strode toward them with purpose, flanked by 2 slave patrollers. The yard grew still as workers sensed the coming storm. "Isaiah Carter," Griggs announced, voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. "Step forward." Isaiah set down his saw carefully, giving Ezekiel's shoulder a gentle squeeze before moving to face Griggs. "We found your little workshop," Griggs spat. Hidden under the floorboards in the old tobacco barn, files for cutting chains, maps of the county, lists of names. He drew his pistol. "You've been organizing escapes, haven't you?" Isaiah said nothing, his spine straight as the boards he'd cut that morning. "Answer me," Griggs shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "I serve God before any man," Isaiah said quietly. The gunshot cracked across the yard like summer lightning. Isaiah stumbled backward, red blooming across his chest. Ezekiel's muscles locked rigid as his father fell, every instinct screaming to run to him, but years of survival training held him frozen in place. Griggs walked to where Isaiah lay, gasping in the dirt. "Let this be a lesson," he announced to the yard. "This is what happens to those who forget their place." He aimed the pistol again and fired a second shot. Isaiah's body jerked once and went still. "Boy," Griggs turned to Ezekiel, "kneel beside your father. You'll stay there until sunset, so everyone remembers what he earned your family." Ezekiel's legs carried him forward without conscious thought. The dirt was warm under his knees as he sank down beside his father's body. Blood soaked into the earth, turning the pale dust dark. Hours passed like molasses. The sun crawled across the sky as workers moved through their tasks, stealing glances at the tableau of father and son. Griggs posted a guard to ensure Ezekiel didn't move, but it wasn't necessary. He remained still as stone, back straight like his father had taught him, eyes fixed on the horizon. The afternoon heat beat down mercilessly. Sweat trickled down Ezekiel's neck, but he didn't lift a hand to wipe it away. Flies began gathering on Isaiah's cooling body. Ezekiel didn't wave them off. Griggs made a point of passing by regularly, boots crunching in the dirt. Sometimes he'd pause, as if waiting for Ezekiel to break, to cry out, to show something he could punish further. But Ezekiel gave him nothing, as still as his father's carpenter tools lying abandoned by the unfinished shed. Workers finished their tasks and filed past, heads bowed. Some whispered prayers, others turned away, unable to bear witness. The sun sank toward the tree line, painting the yard in long shadows. Still Ezekiel knelt, his father's blood dry and cracking on his knees, while the plantation watched and remembered. As the sun touched the horizon, Griggs finally returned to the yard. Workers were shuffling toward their quarters, casting last glances at the scene that would haunt their dreams. Ezekiel's knees had gone numb hours ago, but he remained motionless, his father's blood dried black on his skin. "Get up, boy!" Griggs ordered, prodding Ezekiel's shoulder with his boot. "You're moving to the big house. Master Hale needs another house servant." Ezekiel's legs trembled as he stood, pins and needles shooting through his calves. He didn't look at his father's body, knowing the image was already burned into his memory forever. "Samuel!" Griggs called to one of the house servants. "Take him to the kitchen. Get him cleaned up and show him his duties." He grabbed Ezekiel's chin, forcing eye contact. "One wrong move, boy, and you'll join your father. Understood?" Ezekiel nodded once, face blank as fresh-planed wood. Samuel led him toward the main house, a towering white structure that seemed to glow in the dying light. As they climbed the back steps to the kitchen entrance, Ezekiel caught sight of Edmund Hale through a window, sitting in his study. The plantation owner's eyes met his briefly, then returned to his ledger with practiced indifference. A slight nod to Griggs through the glass confirmed the overseer's actions. The kitchen was warm and humid from the day's cooking. Mary, the cook, clucked her tongue when she saw Ezekiel's blood-stained clothes. Without a word, she filled a basin with warm water and handed him a rag. "Clean yourself up," she said softly. "Then we'll find you something proper to wear." As Ezekiel washed away his father's blood, he could hear the low murmur of voices from the adjacent pantry. 3 elder house servants were talking in hushed tones, unaware of his presence. "Isaiah had it all planned," one whispered. "Routes marked through the swamps, safe houses with free folk up north. Been working on it for years. Had contacts with them maroon communities in the wetlands, too," another added. "Could have moved dozens more families if he'd had time." "Hush now," the third voice warned. "Them walls got ears." Ezekiel scrubbed his hands harder, though they were already clean. His father's network had been vast, carefully built over years of patient planning. Now it lay exposed, like roots torn from the earth. Samuel returned with fresh clothes, a house servant's uniform that hung loose on Ezekiel's frame. "You'll sleep in the kitchen loft," he explained, pointing to a ladder in the corner. "Someone will wake you before dawn." As night settled over the plantation, the kitchen slowly emptied. Ezekiel sat on his new pallet, staring at the rough-hewn beams above. Footsteps creaked on the ladder, and old Ruth's weathered face appeared in the dim light. Ruth had been on the plantation longer than anyone could remember. Her eyes held decades of witnessed horrors, yet still burned with fierce intelligence. She settled beside Ezekiel with a grunt. "Listen close, child," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "They ain't spare you out of mercy. Griggs wants to watch you, See if you'll lead him to others in your daddy's network." She gripped his arm with surprising strength. "But that ain't even the real danger." Ezekiel turned to meet her gaze, waiting. "I seen this before," Ruth continued. "They let the child live after killing the parent. Let everyone think they being merciful. Then a month passes, maybe 2. Her fingers tightened. Child has an accident, falls downstairs, drowns in the creek, gets kicked by a horse." She shook her head slowly. "No witnesses, no questions. Just another tragedy to remind folks who holds the power." She released his arm and began climbing down the ladder. "Your daddy taught you to be careful," she said over her shoulder. "Time to be more than careful. Time to be gone." The kitchen settled into darkness, the only sound the settling of old wood and the distant chirp of crickets. Ezekiel lay back on his pallet, hands folded across his chest, eyes wide open in the dark. Outside, somewhere in the night, his father's body was being prepared for burial by fellow enslaved workers who would dig the grave in secret, away from sanctioned cemetery grounds. Master Hale's house creaked above him, the weight of the system pressing down through every wooden beam. In his study, the plantation owner would be finishing his ledgers, recording the day's loss of property in neat columns of profit and loss. Somewhere in the overseer's cabin, Griggs would be cleaning his pistol, satisfied with the day's lesson in authority. The kitchen was still dark when old Ruth shook Ezekiel awake. "Time," she whispered. He grabbed the small bundle of bread and dried meat she'd hidden under his pallet the night before. Moving like shadows, they crept through the sleeping house. Every floorboard that might creak had been marked in Ezekiel's mind during yesterday's duties. Down the back stairs, past the pantry, through the herb garden where the dew was just starting to gather. The dock workers were waiting at the tree line, 3 massive men who spent their days loading tobacco onto river barges. Without a word, the largest one hoisted Ezekiel onto his shoulders. They moved fast through the pre-dawn darkness, their feet finding paths that weren't there. The sun hadn't yet risen when they heard the first horn blast from the plantation. Ezekiel's absence had been discovered. The dock worker carrying him quickened his pace, sweat already soaking through his shirt, despite the cool morning air. By mid-morning, they were deep in the swamp. The water was knee-deep, thick with mud that tried to pull their feet down with every step. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds around their faces. None of them spoke. The swamp carried sound in strange ways, and slave catchers knew these waters too. When the sun was directly overhead, they stopped on a small rise of dry land. "Eat," one of the men whispered, gesturing at Ezekiel's bundle. "Need your strength." The bread was already growing moldy in the damp air, but Ezekiel forced it down. They heard dogs in the early afternoon. Their baying carried on the hot wind. The dock workers exchanged glances. One of them pulled a small glass bottle from his pocket and sprinkled pepper across their back trail. Another scattered tobacco leaves in their wake. Anything to confuse the hounds. As evening approached, the swamp began to change. The water grew deeper, the trees more ancient. Strange birds called from the canopy. One of the dock workers stumbled, cursing quietly as he sank waist-deep in mud. The others pulled him free, but after that, they moved more slowly, testing each step. Night fell like a blanket, thick and absolute. They kept moving by feel alone, hands reaching from tree to tree. Ezekiel's clothes were soaked through, his skin already starting to chafe. Every splash made him flinch, imagining slave catchers closing in. Near midnight, they reached their first destination, a maroon camp hidden deep in the swamp. Fires burned low in mud-walled pits, carefully screened to prevent any light from reaching above the tree line. Faces emerged from the darkness, men and women who had escaped months or years before, who had built a free life in this deadly terrain. The next weeks passed in a blur of movement. Ezekiel was passed from group to group, each one taking him further from the plantation. They traveled mostly at night, following routes that existed only in memory, and whispered directions through swamps and forests, across hidden fords, past abandoned barns that served as waypoints. The maroon camps blended together in his memory, some large, some just a handful of people. Each had its own ways of surviving, its own carefully guarded secrets. In one, they taught him to move silently through water. In another, how to read the stars, always moving, never staying more than a few days. After a month, they reached the coast. Here, in small fishing communities of free blacks, Ezekiel found another world entirely. Men walked openly with weapons. Children attended secret schools in church basements. The sea air tasted like possibility. He spent the spring and summer in these coastal towns, learning from men who had won or bought their freedom. They taught him about weapons, strategy, the art of moving large groups unseen. Former soldiers showed him maps, explained military tactics. Ship captains taught him to think about supply lines and coordination. The weeks turned to months. Ezekiel grew lean and hard, his child's softness replaced by purpose. He spoke rarely, but when he did, men listened. They saw something in his eyes that resonated with their own hard-won wisdom. 6 months to the day after his father's murder, Ezekiel stood at the plantation border in the dark. Behind him, spread through the trees, 400 armed men waited. Free blacks from the coast, maroons from the swamps, escaped slaves who had found weapons and purpose. They carried muskets, pistols, knives, and farm tools sharpened to deadly purpose. The plantation house glowed in the distance, white walls bright under the moon. Lights still burned in Griggs's cabin. In his study, Master Hale would be updating his ledgers, unaware that all his careful accounting was about to be rendered meaningless. Dawn was still hours away when the fighters made camp just beyond the plantation's border. They moved like smoke between the trees, setting up positions with practiced silence. These were men who had learned stealth as children and honed it through years of survival. Marcus Green, a broad-shouldered freeman from the coast, stepped close to Ezekiel. "The men are asking questions," he whispered. "They want to know why they're following a child." His weathered face showed no judgment, just concern. Beside him, Samuel Jenkins, a former soldier who had bought his freedom, nodded in agreement. They respect the cause, but leadership, he left the rest unsaid. Ezekiel studied the plantation's dark silhouette. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "In 17 minutes, the night patrol will pass that split oak." He pointed to a massive tree at the edge of the tobacco field. 3 men, usually drunk. They walk the same route every night, because the ground is smoother. The men exchanged glances. Samuel crossed his arms. "And you know this how?" "I watched them. Every night, for years." Ezekiel's eyes never left the tree line. "My father taught me to see patterns. The overseers, the patrols, they're creatures of habit. They think they're watching us, but we see everything." As if summoned by his words, 3 shadows appeared at the oak tree. The patrol stumbled along, passing a bottle between them, following exactly the path Ezekiel had described. Marcus let out a low whistle. "That's one patrol," Samuel said. "What else?" "The main guard changes at dawn. 6 men, armed with muskets that haven't been cleaned in months. They gather behind the stable to gamble before their shift." Ezekiel drew a rough map in the dirt with a stick. "The overseer's cabin has 2 doors, but the back one sticks. He keeps his weapons in a chest under his bed." For the next hour, Ezekiel laid out the plantation's rhythms, every weakness, every opportunity, every detail that only a child who had learned to be invisible could know. The men listened with growing respect, as they recognized the precision of his intelligence. As the sky began to lighten, more leaders gathered. Jacob Turner, who commanded 30 men from the coastal settlements, spread out detailed maps of the surrounding plantations. William Foster, a Maroon leader whose fighters knew every hidden path in the swamps, added his knowledge of escape route. "We start with the patrols," Ezekiel said, marking positions in the dirt. "Take their weapons first. Without arms, they can't raise the alarm." His finger traced lines between settlements. "Then we move plantation by plantation. No killing unless necessary. We're not here for revenge. We're here to free people." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "No revenge? After what they did to your father?" Ezekiel's face remained impassive. "Revenge is quick. Freedom lasts." They spent the day planning. Ezekiel's knowledge combined with the military experience of former soldiers and the tactical wisdom of Maroon leaders. Teams were assigned, routes memorized, signals established. Every man knew his role. As sunset approached, 20 fighters took up positions around the night patrol's route. They moved like shadows through the tobacco fields, using the tall plants as cover. Ezekiel watched from the tree line with Marcus and Samuel. Right on schedule, the patrol appeared, already passing their bottle. They never saw the armed men rising from the crops around them. In seconds, it was over. 3 patrolmen disarmed and bound, their weapons distributed among the fighters. "Not a sound," Marcus marveled, watching as the captives were led quietly into the woods, like ghosts. Samuel squeezed Ezekiel's shoulder. "The men won't question your leadership again." He paused. "Your father would be proud." Ezekiel didn't respond. He was already studying the plantation house, where lights were beginning to appear in the windows. The first move had been made, but it was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring harder choices. The captured weapons were passed through the fighters' ranks: 3 muskets, 2 pistols, and a rifle. More importantly, they had gunpowder and shot. Each item was carefully inspected and distributed to the most experienced fighters. As darkness settled over the camp, the men cleaned their newly acquired weapons by firelight. The soft clicking of ramrods and metallic scraping of cleaning tools filled the night air. They worked with the quiet efficiency of men who knew that tomorrow every weapon would need to fire true. Dawn broke harsh and red over the tobacco fields. Ezekiel stood with Marcus and 30 fighters at the edge of the Whitaker plantation, their neighbor to the north. They had come to negotiate, to offer the same terms as before. Surrender weapons, free the enslaved, avoid bloodshed. But the Whitaker overseers had other plans. "They're coming," Samuel called from his position in the trees. At least 20 men, armed. The patrol burst from the tree line on horseback, rifles raised. They didn't slow to talk. The first shot cracked across the morning air, and a freeman to Ezekiel's left fell with a cry. "Take cover!" Marcus shouted, pushing Ezekiel behind a woodpile. The air filled with gun smoke and the thunder of hooves. The horses couldn't maneuver well between the tobacco rows. The freeman fighters used this to their advantage, ducking between the plants, pulling riders from their mounts. The fight turned to chaos on the ground. No formations, no tactics, just desperate men struggling in the mud. Ezekiel clutched his father's carpenter hammer, its familiar wooden handle smooth in his grip. From behind the woodpile, he watched a horse rear up, throwing its rider. The overseer landed hard but rolled to his feet, drawing a knife. A freeman rushed him with a hoe. Metal sparked against metal. The overseer's knife found flesh, and the freeman stumbled back. Without thinking, Ezekiel darted forward. The hammer swung true, just as his father had taught him when driving nails. The overseer's knee shattered with a crack. Something hit Ezekiel from behind. A rifle butt or a boot, he couldn't tell. He tasted dirt and blood. The world spun. Through blurred vision, he saw Marcus grappling with 2 men, his face streaked red. Samuel was on one knee, reloading his musket with shaking hands. "The boy's down!" someone shouted. "Get him out!" But Ezekiel pushed himself up. Blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye. His ribs screamed. He gripped the hammer tighter and moved forward. An older freeman, John from the coastal settlements, stepped in front of him, taking a club blow meant for Ezekiel's head. John crumpled, and Ezekiel swung the hammer again. The attacker fell, clutching his arm. The fight spread across the field like a fever. Men wrestled in the mud with knives and tools. Muskets became clubs when powder ran out. The tobacco plants were trampled, their leaves stained dark with blood. The morning air filled with grunts, screams, and the dull thud of bodies hitting earth. Ezekiel moved through it all like a ghost. The hammer rose and fell. He didn't think about the damage it did, just watched for threats, protected the fallen, pressed forward. His small size let him slip between larger fighters, striking at knees and ankles, dropping men for others to finish. By noon, the field had grown quiet. The surviving Whitaker men retreated, leaving their wounded. The Freeman fighters had won, but victory tasted like copper and dirt. They spent the afternoon tending to the wounded. The tobacco barn became a hospital. Men groaned as bullets were dug out, bones set, gashes stitched. The smell of blood mixed with whiskey used to clean wounds. Ezekiel sat still as Marcus cleaned the cut above his eye. His chest was a map of purple bruises. The hammer lay across his lap, its head dark with dried blood. "You should have stayed back," Marcus said, pressing a cloth to the wound. "You're just a child." "Not anymore." Ezekiel's voice was hoarse. He looked around the barn at the wounded men, men who had come to fight for freedom, who had bled beside him. Some watched him with new eyes. They had seen him fall, seen him rise, seen him fight. Samuel limped over, his leg bandaged. "We lost 6, he reported quietly. 4 of theirs dead. The rest won't trouble us again." He studied Ezekiel's face. "You fought well." Ezekiel nodded once. Words felt heavy in his mouth. His father had died alone in the yard, but today, when Ezekiel fell, men had rushed to protect him. When he stood again, they had fought harder. As dusk settled, the men built fires outside the barn. They ate what food they had, passed around water and whiskey, spoke quietly of the day's battle. The wounded rested on makeshift pallets. Those who could still stand took turns at watch. Ezekiel moved among them, checking bandages, sharing water, learning names. He remembered each face, each wound, each man who had bled for their cause. His own injuries throbbed, but he didn't rest. Leadership wasn't given or taken. It was earned. Today's price had been paid in blood, and tomorrow would demand more. Night wrapped around the plantation like a shroud. The Freeman fighters moved silently through the darkness, taking positions in the tree line, behind outbuildings, and along the fences. Ezekiel crouched with Marcus near the slave quarters, counting shadows as men settled into place. 400 men, Marcus whispered, spread in a complete circle. "No one leaves without us knowing." Ezekiel nodded, his ribs still aching from the morning's battle. The familiar scents of the plantation, tobacco leaves, horse manure, cooking fires, brought back memories of his father. But tonight was different. Tonight, they were the ones watching. Through the small windows of the slave quarters, lanterns flickered. Quiet voices murmured, the plan passed from person to person. Old Ruth had spread the word. When dawn came, rise up from within, while the freemen advanced from without. Hours crept by. Ezekiel studied the big house where he'd briefly served after his father's death. A single light burned in Overseer Griggs's window. The man was awake, perhaps sensing the noose of justice tightening. The eastern sky began to pale. Birds stirred in the trees. Ezekiel gripped his father's hammer, now cleaned of yesterday's blood. "Dawn's coming," Marcus said softly. As if in answer, a rooster crowed. Movement stirred in the slave quarters, people rising earlier than usual, gathering tools, speaking in hushed tones. The morning bell hadn't rung yet. Overseers would notice soon. The first shout came from the north side of the plantation. "Fire! Fire in the stables!" It wasn't fire, just wet hay smoking, creating confusion. But it worked. Overseers and house slaves ran toward the stables. The plantation guards split up, some running to help, others staying at their posts. That's when the slave quarters erupted. Men and women poured out with hoes, scythes, and kitchen knives. They moved with purpose, not chaos, each group knowing their task. Some rushed the guardhouse, others the tool shed where weapons were stored. "Now," Ezekiel commanded. The freemen fighters emerged from their hiding places, weapons ready. They advanced steadily from all sides, closing the circle. The plantation guards found themselves surrounded, caught between angry enslaved people and armed free men. Some guards threw down their weapons, others tried to fight. It didn't last long. Ezekiel moved with a group toward the big house. Inside they found Edmund Hale, the plantation owner, already tied up by his own house servants. The man's face was red with fury and disbelief. "Where's Griggs?" Ezekiel asked. "Ran out the back," a house servant said. "Toward the tobacco barn." They found Griggs trying to saddle a horse. 4 men cornered him while Samuel knocked him down with a rifle butt. The overseer's face hit dirt, the same spot where Isaiah Carter's blood had soaked in months ago. "Bring him to the yard," Ezekiel ordered. By mid-morning, the plantation was secured. The freeman fighters and freed enslaved people gathered in the yard. Griggs knelt in the center, hands bound, finally understanding what real fear felt like. Someone handed Ezekiel a rope. "String him up," voices called from the crowd. "Make him suffer." Ezekiel looked at the rope, then at Griggs. The overseer's eyes were wide with terror. The same look Ezekiel had seen in countless faces under this man's whip. "No," Ezekiel said clearly. "We're not him." Murmurs of protest rose from the crowd. "He killed your father," Marcus reminded him quietly. "I know." Ezekiel's voice carried across the yard. "And we'll judge him proper. But not like this. Not in anger." He turned to the crowd. "We're building something new. If we act like them, we become them." The crowd grew quiet, considering his words. Old Ruth stepped forward, her gray hair catching the morning sun. "The boy's right," she announced. "We ain't them. Never was, never will be." Griggs was locked in the same storage cellar where he'd kept so many others. Guards were posted. There would be time for justice, but it would be delivered with thought, not fury. By noon, the plantation hummed with new energy. Freeman fighters and newly freed people worked together, securing buildings, tending to minor wounds, organizing supplies. Children ran freely in the yard, where once they'd walked in fear. Women sang as they worked, no longer hiding their voices. Ezekiel sat on the steps of the big house, watching it all. His body ached from 2 days of fighting, but his mind was clear. They had taken the plantation without a single death. People who woke up as property now walked as free men and women. Marcus joined him on the steps. "You surprised them today," he said. "Showing mercy like that." "Mercy isn't weakness," Ezekiel replied, remembering the false mercy Griggs had shown him. "True strength is choosing not to hurt when you have every right to." The afternoon sun warmed their faces. For the first time since his father's death, Ezekiel felt something like peace. One plantation was free. Others would follow. Change was coming, not through chaos, but through calculated action and measured justice. The afternoon peace shattered with pounding hoofbeats. A scout burst into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat. "State militia!" he shouted. "Coming from the East Road!" At least 200 men. The calm that had settled over the plantation evaporated. People scattered in panic, some running for the slave quarters, others grabbing weapons. Marcus grabbed Ezekiel's arm. How? They couldn't have organized so fast unless— "Someone warned them," Ezekiel finished. His mind raced through possibilities. "Before we even attacked. They've been marching since yesterday." Another scout arrived from the west side. More militia coming from that direction. They're trying to box us in. Ezekiel's chest tightened. The plantation that had seemed secure now felt like a trap. He ran to the highest point, the big house's second-floor balcony, and scanned the horizon. Dust clouds rose from two directions. Through Isaiah's old spyglass, he could make out the militia's blue uniforms and the glint of rifles. "Get everyone inside," he shouted down to Marcus. "Away from the edges, and bring me hail." The plantation owner was dragged from his makeshift cell, still bound. Ezekiel studied the man's face and saw what he feared, a hint of satisfaction. "You knew," Ezekiel said quietly. "You had a plan in case of uprising." Hale smiled thinly. "Every plantation owner does, boy. Messenger riders posted at intervals. First sign of trouble, they ride for help. The militia's been moving since your attack on the Thompson place yesterday." The sounds of preparation filled the yard below. Freeman fighters took defensive positions in buildings. Women and children were hurried into root cellars. The wounded from yesterday's battle couldn't be moved easily. Samuel, one of the older fighters, joined them on the balcony. "We're surrounded on three sides," he reported. "Only the swamp behind us, and that's too wet for wagons. We can't evacuate everyone in time." "How long?" Ezekiel asked. "An hour, maybe less." Ezekiel's mind raced through options. They had 400 fighters, but many were injured from yesterday. The newly freed people couldn't all escape through the swamp. The militia would have artillery. The plantation's wooden buildings wouldn't stand against cannon fire. Marcus appeared with more news. "Found 2 more messengers tied up in the stable. They were supposed to update the militia on our movements. When they didn't report in, the militia knew exactly where to come." Ezekiel finished. The trap had been laid before they even arrived. Someone called up from the yard. "What about Griggs? We can't leave him to tell them everything." The overseer. Ezekiel's mercy now seemed foolish. If Griggs talked, he could name people, describe their movements, reveal their methods. Every enslaved person who'd helped them would face torture or death. "Bring him up," Ezekiel ordered. They dragged Griggs onto the balcony. The overseer's face was bruised, but his eyes still held defiance. "You'll all hang," Griggs spat. "The law's coming. Real law, not this black rebellion nonsense." Ezekiel studied the man who'd killed his father. The mercy he'd shown hours ago now felt like a child's decision. The world was harder than that. His father had known it. These fighters knew it. Even old Ruth, for all her wisdom about not becoming like them, knew that mercy could kill. "The militia will be here soon," Ezekiel told Griggs. "You know every face that helped us, every name, every hiding place. And I'll tell them everything." Griggs smiled. "Every last detail." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plantation. From the balcony, Ezekiel could see the dust clouds growing closer. The militia would arrive with cannons and torches. They would make examples of everyone. Fighters, freed people, even those who'd only watched. The mercy he'd shown Griggs would condemn hundreds. Marcus touched his shoulder. "Time to decide, boy. We can't hold them off. And watch him, too." Ezekiel felt the weight of his father's hammer. The same hammer that had spilled blood yesterday in the tobacco rows. He'd tried to be better than them, to show that freedom didn't mean becoming like the oppressors. But his father's voice echoed in his memory. "Sometimes, son, mercy to evil is cruelty to good." The militia's drums could be heard now, a distant thunder growing closer. Their horses' hooves shook the earth. The plantation's wooden buildings seemed fragile suddenly, like kindling waiting for a spark. Ezekiel looked at Griggs, then at the faces below. Hundreds of people who'd trusted him, followed him, believed in his leadership. His mercy had put them all at risk. The overseer's smile grew wider, knowing the militia would free him soon. The afternoon sun blazed red through the dust clouds. Time was running out. In less than an hour, The militia would arrive with their cannons and their law. Ezekiel's choice hung in the air like smoke: mercy or survival. The sun sank into a blood-red horizon as the first militia volleys tore through the evening air. Ezekiel watched from the big house window as their lines advanced through the tobacco fields, bayonets gleaming in the dying light. "Now!" he shouted. Hidden fighters rose from between the rows, unleashing a devastating close-range attack. The militia's neat formations shattered as men fell. But more soldiers poured in from both sides, their drums beating a steady advance. Marcus directed the defensive lines while Ezekiel coordinated between groups. They'd positioned their best shooters in the upper windows of the slave quarters and barn. The building's thick wooden walls offered some protection, but cannon fire would tear through them like paper. "They're trying to reach the stables," someone shouted. A group of mounted overseers from neighboring plantations had joined the militia, attempting to flank their position. Ezekiel recognized their leader, Thompson's overseer, still bandaged from yesterday's fight. "Samuel, take 20 men and hold that side," Ezekiel ordered. He watched as Samuel's group engaged the overseers in brutal close combat. Horses screamed, men cursed, metal struck metal. The fighting moved between buildings, neither side gaining ground. The militia commander's voice carried across the yard. "Surrender now and you'll be spared. Resist, and we'll burn every building with you inside." A cannon boomed in response. The shot went wide, splintering a corner of the barn. Women and children huddled in the root cellars screamed. Ezekiel felt the vibrations through the floorboards. "They're testing range," Marcus said grimly. "Next one won't miss." Ezekiel studied the battlefield through his father's spyglass. The militia had split into 3 groups, one pressing the front, 2 moving to cut off the swamp escape route. Their numbers were greater than expected. Fresh troops must have joined during their approach. A second cannon shot exploded against the barn's upper level. Wooden beams cracked. Fighters scrambled to new positions as smoke filled the air. The militia advanced under cover of the chaos. "Fall back to the house!" Ezekiel shouted. "Draw them in closer!" Their only advantage was in close fighting, where numbers mattered less than desperation. The fighters retreated in stages, maintaining fire to slow the militia's advance. But the enemy kept coming, professional soldiers moving with practiced precision. They reached the edge of the yard just as true darkness fell. Then everything changed. Hidden fighters burst from the root cellars, attacking the militia's rear ranks. Others emerged from behind the slave quarters, striking the flanks. The neat military lines dissolved into chaotic hand-to-hand combat. Ezekiel lost track of who was winning. The yard became a maze of individual battles. A militiaman charged through the front door with a bayonet. Ezekiel swung his father's hammer, feeling bone crack. More soldiers pushed in. The house's narrow halls worked against their numbers, but they kept coming. "The barn's on fire!" someone screamed. Flames lit the night sky, casting everything in hellish orange. The heat drove more fighters toward the house, concentrating the violence. Ezekiel found himself fighting beside Marcus as militia broke through a side door. They fought room by room, furniture splintering, walls painted with blood. Every fighter knew surrender meant death. If not by hanging then, by slower means back in chains. A tremendous crash shook the building. Part of the roof had collapsed, probably from cannon fire. Smoke poured down the stairs. The militia commander's voice rose again. "Burn them out!" But his words cut off suddenly. Through the windows, Ezekiel saw more fighters emerging from the swamp. The rear guard he'd positioned yesterday. They hit the militia's cannon crews first, then charged into the disorganized mass in the yard. The battle's tide turned. Caught between defenders in the house and fresh attackers from behind, the militia's formation crumbled. Men threw down weapons and ran. The mounted overseers turned their horses and fled into the darkness. Fighting continued for another hour, but the outcome was decided. By the time the moon rose, the yard was littered with bodies and weapons. The barn burned to ashes. The big house's walls were scarred by bullets and blood. They counted losses as the night deepened. 60 fighters dead, over 100 wounded. But they held the plantation. The militia's retreat had been chaotic. They'd left their cannons behind. Near midnight, they dragged Griggs from his makeshift cell in the kitchen root cellar. The overseer's defiant smile was gone, replaced by fear as he faced the crowd of survivors. Blood and soot covered their faces. Eyes that had seen too much death glinted in the moonlight. Ezekiel stepped forward, his father's hammer dark with dried blood. The gathered fighters parted before him, forming a circle around Griggs. No one spoke. The night wind carried the smell of gunpowder and burning wood. The crowd waited for Ezekiel's word. Justice or mercy? The choice that would define what their freedom meant. Griggs stumbled as the fighters shoved him into the center of the circle. His fine overseer's coat was torn and filthy from his time in the root cellar. Moonlight caught the terror in his eyes as he looked at the faces surrounding him. "Speak!" Ezekiel commanded, his voice carrying across the yard. "Tell them what you did. All of it." Griggs shook his head, lips pressed tight. One of the older fighters stepped forward with a ledger recovered from the office. "We found your records, Griggs. Every whipping, every sale, every death. Written in your own hand." "Lies!" Griggs spat, but his voice trembled. Marcus pressed the cold barrel of a militia rifle against Griggs's spine. "The truth! Now! Or we'll make it slower." The overseer's composure cracked. Words spilled out in a desperate rush. "I did what the law allowed. What every overseer does." "Names," Ezekiel demanded. "Dates, every person you killed." And so it began. For nearly an hour, Griggs recited his crimes to the silent crowd. Isaiah Carter's murder. 3 women whipped to death for dropping tobacco leaves. A teenage boy shot for learning to write. 2 elderly men worked until their hearts gave out. Children sold away from mothers. Families torn apart for profit. Samuel wrote everything down, his quill scratching in the darkness. Other fighters gathered ledgers, letters, and account books from the office, documentation of systematic cruelty hidden behind legal language. "The northern papers will print this," Marcus said. "Every detail, every name. Let the whole country see what really happens on these plantations." Griggs' confession became increasingly frantic as he realized its purpose. "You can't! The law protects. The law." Ezekiel's quiet voice cut through Griggs's protests. "The law watched my father die in the dirt." 4 men who'd lost family to Griggs's cruelty stepped forward. They carried rope. The overseer tried to run but was caught immediately. No one spoke as they dragged him to the same oak tree where he'd murdered Isaiah. Dawn's first light crept over the horizon as Griggs's body swayed in the morning breeze. Samuel carefully packed the documents and confessions into oilcloth wrapping. Runners would carry copies to 3 different northern abolitionist presses before the week's end. Scouts reported the militia had withdrawn to a safe distance, unwilling to risk another night battle. Their commander sent a rider under white flag, threatening consequences. Marcus met him at the property line with copies of Griggs's confession and the plantation records. "Attack again," Marcus told the rider, "and every newspaper from Boston to Philadelphia prints these. Every name, every crime, every owner and overseer who profited. Think carefully about what that means for your precious order." The rider's face paled as he read. Within an hour, the militia began their full retreat. The threat of exposure proved stronger than any force of arms. As the sun rose fully, the fighters began evacuating the plantation. Wounded were carried on wagons commandeered from the stables. Women and children emerged from the root cellars, gathering what few possessions they could carry. The dead were buried quickly, but with respect, fighters and militia alike. Former house slaves stripped the building of valuables and food. Field hands destroyed tools and burned remaining tobacco stores. No one would work this land again under the lash. By mid-morning, smoke rose from multiple points across the property. Not the violent blaze of battle, but the controlled burns of erasure. Buildings that had witnessed generations of suffering were systematically reduced to ash. The fighters moved in groups, heading for predetermined safe routes to the swamps and coastal settlements. Some would journey north. Others would disperse into maroon communities. A few would filter into southern cities, building new networks of resistance. Ezekiel walked the empty yard one last time, his father's hammer hanging heavy at his side. The morning sun cast long shadows across ground stained dark with spilled blood. Wind stirred the ashes of the barn. The big house stood silent, its windows like vacant eyes. Marcus waited at the property line with the last group of fighters. Beyond them lay miles of dangerous country, but also paths to freedom. They had won this battle, but all knew the larger war continued. A final pair of runners departed with the precious documents, evidence that would expose the plantation system's brutality to the wider world. The truth would spread, even as those who lived it moved on to other fights. The survivors gathered their strength, readying themselves for the journey ahead. They had struck a blow for justice, but survival now meant movement. The plantation that had once seemed like the whole world to an enslaved child stood empty behind them. The rising sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as Ezekiel led the first group of refugees through the dense swampland. Women carried sleeping children on their backs, while men took turns supporting the elderly. They moved slowly but deliberately, following paths only visible to experienced eyes. "Watch your step here," Ezekiel warned, pointing to a patch of deceptively solid-looking ground. "The mud's deeper than it looks." He'd learned these routes during his own escape months ago, memorizing every safe crossing and hidden danger. They rested briefly at midday, sharing dried meat and hard bread from their supplies. A young mother named Sarah cradled her infant, looking nervously over her shoulder. "How much further?" "Half a day to the first settlement," Ezekiel answered, checking the sun's position. "The maroon camp will take us in until we can move you further north." The afternoon brought heavy rain, but they pressed on. Ezekiel helped a limping old man across a narrow log bridge, steadying him with careful hands that seemed too mature for his 11 years. By sunset, the first group reached the maroon settlement, a collection of sturdy wooden structures hidden in a dense grove. Marcus emerged from the trees with 3 armed scouts, the militias still withdrawn. "Second group's about 4 hours behind us." Ezekiel nodded, already planning the next day's movements. "Get these folks settled. I'm heading back to guide the others." He worked through the night, moving between groups spread across miles of swamp. Some needed medical attention. Others had lost their way in the darkness. Ezekiel found them all, drawing on his memory of patrol patterns to avoid dangerous areas. The second day dawned gray and cold. Ezekiel led another group along the river's edge, where the ground was firmer. A young boy about his age stumbled, crying out in exhaustion. Without hesitation, Ezekiel lifted the boy's arm over his shoulders, supporting his weight. "My papa carried me like this," Ezekiel said quietly, "when I was too tired to walk. We're almost there." By midday, more families reached the safety of free black settlements along the coast. Children were quickly fed, while adults received medical care and fresh clothing. Ezekiel moved constantly between arrivals, ensuring everyone had what they needed. "You should rest," Marcus told him, as afternoon faded toward evening. "You haven't slept in 2 days." But Ezekiel shook his head, already heading back out. One more group still on the path. Elder Ruth is with them. The final group arrived just before nightfall. 15 people, including Ruth, who had helped save Ezekiel's life months ago. She hugged him fiercely, then held him at arm's length. "You've done what needed doing," she said. "But there's blood on your hands now, child. Don't let it stain your soul." Ezekiel looked down at his palms, still dirty with mud and dried blood from the battle. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the river that marked the settlement's border. The water ran cold and clear in the dying light. Ezekiel knelt at the edge, plunging his hands into the current. Dirt and blood swirled away downstream, but he kept scrubbing. His father's blood, Griggs's blood. The blood of fighters and militia who died following his commands. The sun touched the horizon, painting the river copper. Ezekiel finally stood, his clean hands dripping river water. He would not stay to rule or lead. The settlements had their own leaders, the fighters their own commanders. His presence would only draw attention they couldn't afford. He shouldered his small pack, his father's hammer still hanging at his side. The northern road stretched ahead, winding through territories where other plantations still held people in chains, where other overseers dealt out cruelty under law's protection. "Going somewhere?" Marcus asked, appearing silently beside him. "The story needs to spread," Ezekiel replied, "about what we did here. What can be done?" Marcus nodded slowly. "A walking warning." "Not just warning," Ezekiel said. "Hope, too. Like my father taught about escape routes. Sometimes you have to show people the path before they believe it exists." The sun slipped lower, shadows lengthening across the river. Soon darkness would provide cover for movement. Ezekiel took one last look at the settlement, where rescued families were beginning new lives. Then he turned north, becoming another shadow among many in the gathering dusk. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.